This morning, we're looking at a passage in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. It's a very famous passage, a very poetic passage. The passage begins, "There's a time for everything, and a season for every activity under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die." So it seemed fitting, given how famous that passage is, that we begin with a famous song. So sit back for a moment and listen to the first few opening bars of this famous song. Now, some of you of a certain age were probably expecting a different song. How many of you thought that we might be playing a different song? Yes, what you were probably expecting is a song by Pete Seeger and the Byrds called "Turn, Turn, Turn." But there's a lesson I learned in preaching when it comes to the introductions of the sermon. What you really want to do is introduce the topic and not just the text. And while the Byrds song "Turn, Turn, Turn" is verbatim from Ecclesiastes 3 verses 1 to 8, and so introduces the text really well, it's actually a Vietnam War protest song. And the message of the song is actually the opposite of what Ecclesiastes 3 is trying to say. So whereas the song introduces the text well, it does not introduce our topic very well. So I chose a different song, and actually a more famous song. The song you heard a snippet to is by a man named Vivaldi, and that little bit is the opening of Spring, which is part of a larger work called The Four Seasons. This doesn't have words at all to it. This doesn't have the words that go with Ecclesiastes 3, but the idea that there are seasons in the year, spring, summer, fall, and winter, and that those seasons come into our life not by our control, but simply because we live in this world. That's actually more on topic for what Ecclesiastes 3 is talking about. This work, The Four Seasons, is also part of a larger work that Vivaldi did, which is entitled "The Contest Between Harmony and Invention." And the idea is that in music, there are seasons in a song or in a piece for what you might consider sort of conventional compositional technique in music. And there are also seasons for creative imagination. And what a composer is doing is putting together sort of these various seasons into the same song. That's what he was doing. If we put it in modern terms, some of the praise choruses that we just sang, they have chorus, verse, bridge. These are different seasons or different parts of the song, and the musicians who are playing, the people who are singing, we have to submit to the various seasons. If you're in the chorus, you sing the chorus. If you're in the verse, you sing the verse. If you're in the bridge, you sing the bridge. And they have different seasons in the song. That's our topic for this morning, is that in life, just as in the calendar year and just like in music, there are various seasons that we all go through. And so this morning, would you please take a Bible and turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. It's page 540 in the church Bibles, Ecclesiastes chapter 3. The other reason why I didn't play the Pete Seeger Bird song is because it's really hard to get that out of your head once you start thinking about that tune. So we don't have that in our heads at this moment, hopefully. Ecclesiastes 3, I'm going to read verses 1 to 8. It's page 540 in the church Bibles. "There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. It's a beautiful piece of poetry speaking about the seasons of life. Let me make 4 observations about this passage that are important for us as we try to hear what God is saying to us through His Holy Spirit. Number 1, I want you to notice in this passage that the focus is more on activity that we're doing in a various season and not life stages. Do you see in verse 1, there is a season for every activity under the heavens. It can be very easy when you think about seasons of life to think through childhood, teenage years, young adults, newly married, retirement, the sort of life stages that you might think of. And while, yes, those can be part of the seasons of life, notice that God is focusing on activities and not on demographics. And that's because activities unite while demographics tend to divide. What I mean is, if you are in a season of learning and study, that would be the activity. It doesn't really matter whether you're 5 years old and just launching into kindergarten, or 75 years old going back to school after 30 years of being away. It doesn't really matter what your age is. What matters is the activity is you're both in a season of learning and studying. Likewise, if you're going through a financially difficult time, it doesn't matter whether you're 80 years old in retirement or you're a college student trying to figure out how to deal with debt. If you are in a season of want, a season of need, a season of struggle, the activity is the same. The season is the same. If you're going through a health crisis, it doesn't really matter whether you are single, dating, married, or divorced. The activity of struggling with health, the difficulty of getting up each morning, of dealing with chronic pain, of wondering how is this all going to turn out. It's the activity that is the focus, not so much the demographics. For our country, regardless of all the various ages, life situations represented in this country, we are in a season of electing officials. This is an election season. We have all of that. All of us have that in common. For us as a church, we are in a season of renewing. We're in the midst of a capital campaign. That is the activity that all of us are doing together, regardless of what our background may be, regardless of what our stage of life may be. And so the question this morning as we come to this passage is, what season of life are you in? And again, I'm not talking about, well, are you in retirement? Are you in school? I'm talking about what is the activity that you are focused on right now? What is the season that you are in? Are you in a time of caring for others? Whether young children or aging parents. Or are you in a season of being cared for? Having to humble yourself and accept care from others? Are you in a season of serving? Are you in a season of rest? Are you in a season of wilderness wandering where you're not sure where you are and you're struggling with doubt and you're trying to make sense of everything? Or are you in a season of assurance and certainty and feeling confident about where you're going? Are you in a promised land right now? Are you on your way to a promised land? Are you in a season of exile? The question for each of us this morning from this passage is, what season are you in today? Not what age are you, not what's your marital status, not as whether you have children or don't have children, not whether you're in retirement or not. What is the activity that God has put forefront on your plate? Are you in a season of enduring? Are you in a season of taking new ground? What season are you in? Second observation, as you think about what season you're in, as I think about what season I'm in, please notice in this passage, none of these things are seasons of sin. Now, the observant reader might read verse 8 and say, wait a second. A time to love and a time to hate. I thought hatred was a sin. We're not supposed to hate other people. Absolutely. But the word for hate here is more in line with what Jesus is talking about when he says, unless a person hates their father and mother, their siblings, their house, their home, even their own life, they cannot be my disciple. This word for hate doesn't mean sort of bitter hatred and vengeful anger towards somebody. What it means is not choosing something or disconnecting from something so that you can connect to something else. Verse 8 is saying that there are seasons for disconnecting and there are seasons for connecting. There's a time for love and a time for disconnecting from others. So if you go back through the list, there are no sins listed in here, and that's because sin is never a season. There are no seasons in which we live in sin because sin is not a season, it's an addiction. Have you ever asked anybody, they usually have to have grown up in kind of Christian circles to give you this response. Have you ever asked them, like, how are you doing on your spiritual journey? And they might glibly or cheekily respond, I'm working on my testimony. By which they mean they're sort of sowing their wild oats, they're living their prodigal life with the idea that someday when the season is over, they'll return to the Lord and then they'll have a really cool testimony about how God rescued them out of addiction to this or that. Please, my friends, do not be fooled by this. There are no seasons of sin. There is no season of alcoholism. There's no season of gambling. There is no season of infidelity. These are addictive powers, and the more you engage in them, the more they come to dominate who you are. If you go into those things, you may never come out of them. That is not what this passage is talking about. So if you think about what season are you in, let me urge you and encourage you if you think, well, I'm kind of in a season of being unfaithful. That is not a season. That's an addiction. Stop doing it ASAP. Get out. I know you think, and it's a lie from Satan, that you'll give way to this for a while. And then when the time is right, you'll choose to stop doing it. That's a lie from Satan. He knows the longer you do this, the more powerful the addiction becomes. So please notice in this list, there is nothing listed here as a sin to be like, oh, this is my season for gambling. This is my season for abusing drugs. This is my season for giving way to anger. So if you read verse 8, and if you think, well, this is my season for vengeful hatred towards my ex-husband, or vengeful hatred towards my ex-wife, please don't be fooled. That is not a season. If you let bitterness take root, it may not come out. So the second observation is when we think about what seasons of life we're in, we're not thinking about sin. We want to get rid of sin as soon as possible. The third observation from this passage is that the reason why there are so many verses, I try to kind of pause along the way because you get tired of saying a time for this, a time for that, a time for this, a time for that, a time for this. It's 8 verses of a time for this, a time for that. But that is intentional on God's part. What he's trying to say is that this is meant to cover the breadth of life, that all of us go through seasons in life. No one gets through life without experiencing various seasons, some of them positive and some of them negative. There is no person who lives life on the mountaintop and never goes into the valley. But likewise, there is no one who lives in the valley and never gets to experience the mountaintop. And so the encouragement today is that God is wanting to cover the breadth of life. And perhaps you're here this morning and maybe you're suffering from circumstantial depression. And you feel like it's always going to be this way. It's not. It's a season that you're in right now. God's allowed that season, but it will not be all of life. Likewise, maybe you're here and you're just killing it at your job and you're doing fantastic. And you could never imagine you ever losing that job or being unemployed. I hope you don't. But there are seasons of life. And there may come a season in which God disconnects you from whatever job that you're in now. So the purpose of this passage and all that it has here is to show us there are lots of seasons. Some are good, some are hard. And the honest thing about Ecclesiastes, we said the beautiful thing about Ecclesiastes is it helps us to be honest, is you can recognize and acknowledge, you know what? I'm in a not very good season right now. Or you can rejoice and say, this is fantastic, but I know there might be some difficulty coming. The blessing of the honesty of what the Spirit is doing is it's not Christian to walk around and say everything is great all of the time. We're always blessed. We're always receiving grace. But what the Holy Spirit is saying in this passage is there's some brutally difficult things we go through. And we live in those seasons, sometimes for a long time. And the encouragement and the acknowledgement that yes, this is a hard season. Fourth observation is that the seasons of life happen under the sovereignty of God. Solomon refers to this obliquely in verse 1. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. You could also translate under heaven. Now, we don't pay much attention to that, under the heavens. That seems like a very Christian way to say stuff. But this is not Solomon's normal way of talking about these things. In fact, look back with me. It's still in Ecclesiastes. Just glance back into chapter 2, verse 17. So I hated life because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Verse 18. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. Verse 19, and who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish, yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil, into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. Verse 20, so my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. Verse 22, what do people get for all the toil and anxious striving which they labor under the sun? Under the sun, under the sun, under the sun. Do you hear it over and over again? When you keep going to chapter 3, all of a sudden, for every activity under the, you would think it was sun, but he writes heaven. And that's because he's trying to acknowledge that when we are engaging in toil and activity, we're sort of doing it under the sun. But when the seasons of life we experience, this is under the sovereignty of God. He's brought heaven into the story. You could translate this as, there is a time for everything, a season for every activity, under the watchful care of God, under the sovereignty of God, under the control of God. When we're doing stuff, it's under the sun. But here, the Holy Spirit is acknowledging that the seasons of life are happening under the sovereignty of God. This is actually why the Pete Seeger song, Turn, 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 is the exact opposite message of this. As a Vietnam War protest song, and if you go home and listen to the song, you don't hear it until you get to the very last line. The very last line of the song is basically giving you the impression that we could change the seasons of life. That's the point of the song, is that if we take the time and do this right, we can change the seasons of life. That's the opposite of what Ecclesiastes 3 is saying. Ecclesiastes 3 is saying is God is in control of the seasons of life. God is the one who has orchestrated these seasons. And just like spring turns to summer and summer turns to fall and fall turns to winter, whether we like it or not, there are seasons in our life and we have to accept them. Just like the composer has put pieces of music into his song, and if we're going to genuinely sing this song, we have to submit to the various aspects in the song. So too, God has placed seasons in our life. That's why there's no sin in here, because God is never the author of sin. God has placed seasons in our lives, and the purpose of Ecclesiastes 3 is to say, and we need to accept them. So here's the point that Ecclesiastes is making. It's the point for you and I today from the Spirit. God is asking us today, discern what season you're in. What season are you in right now? And how can you accept it? It may be a season for mourning. It may be a season for dancing. It may be a season for birth. It may be a season with death. It may be a season with financial struggle. It may be a season with financial freedom. It may be a season in which you feel like you've got more friends and you know what to do with. It may be a season of loneliness. You see, we think that sort of our personalities are a certain way, and we get our Enneagram numbers and we talk to people about personality tests and we think about all these things. In reality, our personalities all change depending on the season in which we're in. Whether you're an extrovert or an introvert, if you're in a season of mourning, it's a sad and hard season. And so this morning, God is saying, let's focus on who you are from a personality point of view, and more discerning what is the season that you are in, and how can you and I accept this is what goes with this season. Now, I will say before we leave this topic that while I've kind of given Pete Seeger and the Byrds a hard time for their song, I do want to acknowledge that the impulse to want to change the season that you're in is actually a good impulse. Because what this should do when you read Ecclesiastes 3 is there can be a sense of fatalism. Like, okay, well, this is just the season I'm in. There's nothing I can do about it. And you can read this and think, but wait a second, what if I'm in a season of mourning? What if I'm in a season of loneliness? What if I'm in a season of struggle? What if I'm in a season of financial need? What if I'm in a season of sickness? What if I'm in a season in which I'm just simply exhausted? Is there nothing I can do about it? That's a good question. One of the blessings of Ecclesiastes is it helps us to see things from a certain perspective, but also opens the door to say there is more to this topic than just what we find in Ecclesiastes. So before we leave this idea of seasons of life, I want to take us to another passage and read that in light of Ecclesiastes 3. So if you will, would you turn to the book of Daniel, chapter 2. Daniel 2, it's page 720 in the church Bibles. Now, we're just going to jump right in the middle of a passage. So while you're finding Daniel 2, page 720, let me tell you the story so that when we jump in, it makes sense. Daniel and 3 of his friends are Jewish men living in exile in Babylon, and a man named Nebuchadnezzar is king. Nebuchadnezzar, when he has all of these young men come from these various places that he has conquered, he looks for the best and the brightest, and he puts them into this management training program where they're going to end up being consultants or wise people, those who are advisors to the king. And so Daniel and his 3 friends are chosen for this track. They are trained and they go through all of this stuff and they learn a lot of things and they become part of kind of the consultant class or the advisor class, giving advice to the king. Well, one day Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And he wants to know what his dream means because it was a very vivid and very powerful dream. And so it's not very strange. This happened all the time. King would normally summon the advisors and the wise people, come in and help me understand this dream. Although in this case, Nebuchadnezzar does something totally unexpected. He calls in a group of the wise people. Daniel's not in that group. He calls a group of them in and was like, all right, I need help with my dream. And they're like, great, that's what we're here for. That's what you pay us for. What's your dream? He's like, no, actually, I would like you to tell me my dream and then explain it to me. Now, if you think about this is ridiculous. How could you ever do this? Think about it for a moment. Like if you knew somebody really, really well and they asked you, what do you think I'm thinking right now? You might actually be able to take a guess at that. But if they said to you, hey, I had a dream last night, guess what was in my dream? You would be like, I don't know, you were a fish? There was like a green cat, there's lightning. How would you even begin to guess? Well, that's what they ask. That's what Nebuchadnezzar asked. Tell me my dream. And so the wise men rightly say to him, no one could ever do that. So Nebuchadnezzar's like, all right, fine. You're not worth your money. I'm going to kill you all. Well, this is a harsh pronouncement. Well, Daniel's not even present. He hears the news. He's going to be killed because he's part of this advisor consultant class. Now, Ecclesiastes 3, maybe he would have just said, well, time to be born, a time to die. This is my season for dying. That's that sort of fatalistic, like, well, this is the seasons of life. It happens under the sovereignty of God. God has preordained that I'm going to die today. I guess it's just a bad day. That's not what Daniel does. Verse 18 of chapter 2, he urges them, his friends, to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his." And then look at the next phrase. He changes times and seasons. The message of Daniel 2 is discern what season you're in and ask God to change it. Now, wait a second. The message of Ecclesiastes 3 is discern what season you're in and accept it. And the message of Daniel 2 is discern what season you're in and ask God to change it. Well, which do we do? This is a very Ecclesiastes 3 kind of problem. There's a season for accepting, and there is a season for asking for change. How do we make sense of this? We make sense of it in the person of Jesus. Jesus, too, found himself in a season of suffering and death. He did not want to go to the cross in his human nature. He did not want to go through what the Father was asking him to go through. And so Jesus prayed a prayer and taught us to pray it this way. Lord, not my will, but yours be done. Lord, if there's no other way, please help me to accept your will. That's how we navigate between Ecclesiastes 3 and Daniel 2. And this morning, if you are in a season of life that is painful and difficult, please do not simply take the fatalistic approach of God doesn't care, it doesn't matter, I just endure this till the next season comes. The encouragement is, if, for example, you're in a season of loneliness, the prayer you want to pray is, God, I don't want to be lonely anymore. Lord, I would love if you would provide just one close friend. But Lord, if this is a season that I get to draw closer to you in my loneliness, please help me to accept that. If you're in the season of sickness and you're just simply exhausted, going from one doctor's appointment to the next, waking up with chronic pain, going through difficult news after difficult news, your prayer is, Lord, please would you take this from me? Please, Lord, would you heal me? Please, Lord, can this season be over as soon as possible? But if during this season of suffering, you have chosen this for me, if you want to use this to grow my relationship with you, if you want to help me to be more encouraging and comforting to others because of what I'm suffering, then not my will, but yours be done. If you're in a season of financial need, and you're like, man, I'm tired of living from paycheck to paycheck. Lord, I feel like I can't make this work. Your prayer is, dear God, if at all possible, could you let this season end? Could you provide somehow financially in the midst of this? But if not, Lord, if this is my way to learn to be dependent on you, not my will, but yours be done. If this is a season of temptation in which you just struggle day after day with the temptation to sin, and you think, why can't I be free of this? Lord, you could just wave your hand and it could be gone. God, I look at other people and they don't have the same struggle. It's a daily battle and I'm exhausted. Your prayer is, Lord, if you are willing, take this from me. God, take the desire from me. Take the temptation from me. But if, God, you want to teach me that you are gracious in the midst of my temptations, if you want me to rely on you every day, and you've left this in my life so that I will, then may your will be done. What Ecclesiastes 3 and Daniel 2 both teach us is that God is in control of all things. All of us go through seasons of life. We discern the season, and if the Lord won't change it, we accept it. Currently, our church is in a season of doing a building project. I can tell you earnestly that I have asked God for a different season. A capital campaign is not on my list of things that I would like to do. But as the elders, we have prayed and discerned. God has said, this is your season as a church. And so we're trying our best to accept it. There may be a season that you're going through, that the Lord brought you here this morning to say, no, I actually want you to come and pray. I want you to pray yourself out of this season. Whatever it is, the Holy Spirit will lead you through it. And the truth of Ecclesiastes 3 and Daniel 2 is we all go through seasons of life. Sometimes the Spirit asks us to accept them. Sometimes the Spirit motivates us to pray for change. But in either case, we're not in charge. He is.